Welcome everybody to this meeting of the Alcohol Health Alliance Ireland. My name is Sheila Gilheeney. I'm with Alcohol Action Ireland. So just a couple of things I wanted to say before we get going properly, just a wee bit of housekeeping here. This is a Zoom meeting, and so it's actually a little bit different from a Zoom webinar. And so the first thing I'd just maybe ask is that that people would perhaps mute themselves unless they're actually speaking, just to help with the sound. The meeting is also being recorded, so if you would prefer not to be seen on the recording, you could turn your camera off, but if you want to leave it on, that's perfectly fine. But just to be aware that we are recording this, and we'll have it up on our website afterwards. And again, because this is a meeting, it's very much we're hoping for participation and sort of input from yourselves. So we'll come back to that, and Jennifer is actually going to be monitoring any of the chat that's going on and asking questions from that. But I think with that housekeeping underway and hopefully covered at this stage, I'm going to hand over now to Professor Frank Murray. Frank is the chair of the Alcohol Health Alliance, and I'm just going to let you introduce what this meeting is about and what we're hoping to get from it. Thank you, Frank.
Good afternoon, everybody, and I'd like to welcome you all to the online meeting here this afternoon, brought together by Alcohol Health Alliance Ireland, and thanks, Sheila, very much for organising it. The reason we're back again after a gap is because of the new challenges we face. Some or many or all of you were involved in the Public Health Alcohol Bill and the advocacy that led up to that. And that was, I think, a bill which was enacted and had further measures because of the advocacy, because of the many different voices that were heard at that time and which were listened to at that time. So the Public Health Alcohol Act is, I think, a great credit to the power of many different voices acting together, trying to reduce alcohol harms here in Ireland. And as you know, that bill was unique in Ireland because for the first time, it treated alcohol as a health issue, not simply as an economic issue. And the measures in that bill have led to widespread international recognition of Ireland as a very important area for struggling to reduce alcohol harms in the face of an incredibly powerful industry. Now, on the background of that, we now face going in the opposite direction with the sale of alcohol bill, and that's why we're here today, is to see what can we do to make our voices heard together to reduce the measures within the sale of alcohol bill, which we think are going to be very harmful. I mean, the sale of alcohol bill is going in the opposite direction of the Public Health Alcohol Act. It's going towards increasing hours, increasing locations of sale, the number of outlets for alcohol, introducing a more commercially friendly alcohol licensing system with no limit on the number of sites selling alcohol, and an absence of enforcement measures around the harmful sale of alcohol, for instance, virtually or to minors. So several of the organizations which are represented here were before the Oireachtas Justice Committee recently, with a view to making our voices heard in terms of highlighting the harms that are intrinsic in this bill. And indeed, the Justice Committee did publish a series of recommendations which it sent to the Department of Justice in relation to that. So that's the sort of background to why we're here today. And it's also worth saying that we're here because the alcohol industry sells a series of myths. It fails to warn people adequately of the harms of alcohol, although that's going to change in 3 years' time. The industry profits hugely from harmful drinking of alcohol, particularly by the small minority of people who drink 2/3 of the alcohol in the country. So they know they make a huge amount of their profits through selling to people who drink in a hazardous way. And also, to my astonishment, the alcohol industry pays for none of the downstream costs of alcohol. So it's against that context that the sale of alcohol bill is coming in, and many of us are very alarmed about that, and we feel it's very important that we try to act together to reduce alcohol harms. Now, with that in mind, we have two speakers here this afternoon who are going to address these issues, Drs. Ollie Bartlett and Sheila Gilhenny. And we'll start first of all with Ollie, who's going to make a presentation. He is a member of the legal department in University of Maynooth, where he's assistant professor of law and he's director of postgraduate studies, and he's going to talk to us today on some of the legal aspects of the Public Health Alcohol Bill. He is himself an expert in terms of public health law, both locally in these islands and in Europe. So, Ollie, we look very much forward to hearing your presentation now, and I pass the floor over to you.
And actually, can I just jump in here and can I ask that everybody please mute themselves? As I say, we're not on a webinar here. This is actually a meeting. I'll try and do a mute all, but I'm afraid that I might actually mute her.
You can mute people if you're the whole.
Yeah, I'm just having a problem with muting here at the moment.
Lenovo's iPhone anyway.
I suspect the person who's talking can't hear us actually, but there is somebody talking. If they could turn off their microphone, we'd be grateful. Thank you.
Okay, I think the background noise has stopped, so I'll get going. Thank you very much indeed, Frank, for a very kind introduction. Thank you so much.
Sorry, Sheila, we're looking at a kind of a big blank Zoom screen and the presentation is kind of stuck over in the corner.
Right, let me try and fix that. Is that better?
Yeah.
Put it on presenter mode. I think it'd be better, Ollie.
Pardon, sorry?
If you put it on presenter mode, I think it might be better.
All right. Yes. No worries. So there we go. I think that should fix that now. Hopefully everybody can see that now. Assume so. All right, there is quite a lot of background noise still, but hopefully everybody can hear me. So I'm just going to proceed. As I say, the guy that's joining from the train, by the looks of things, Lenovo's iPhone.
There's a Lenovo's iPhone. There's Andrea's iPhone. It's still not on mute either.
Yeah. So yeah, hopefully whoever's there can cut the background noise. I'm just going to continue because otherwise we'll lose time. So again, thank you very much indeed, Frank.
Welcome aboard this enterprise service.
And now all I can, now all I can hear is the train announcer. Anyway, and thank you, Sheila. Right, I got to that bit last. Thank you, Sheila, for setting up this important meeting. It's my pleasure to come and talk to you guys today. As Frank said, I've spent a fair amount of time researching the regulation of alcohol, and I'm just coming now to this sale of alcohol bill, and it's my pleasure to present some of my thoughts today on that bill. I'm hopefully not going to take too long because I obviously like to leave plenty of time for, of course, Sheila to do her presentation and for questions, which I always think are more helpful anyway than me rambling on. So I am going to split the 20 minutes or so that I have into a few parts just to talk across what I see as the key issues raised by this sale of alcohol bill. Key legal issues from a public health perspective, that is, And as far as I can see, there are 5 main ones. There will, of course, be others, likely be others that I've overlooked or neglected. And of course, I'm very happy for questions afterwards to prompt further discussion of those. But I think these are the key 5. First, it being much easier to get a license in general, following if this bill is put into law. Of course, the longer sales hours, which are the sort of headline grabbing change made by the bill. The matter of online sales, which was flagged with much fanfare at the launch of the bill, but actually I think is a key area of concern. The protection of minors, which again has not been given adequate thought as far as I'm concerned. And finally, the often neglected but still quite important matter of enforcement and monitoring of the legislation. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into a bit of an exploration of those issues. By the way, if there's anything confusing about what I say, then please, as I tell my students, I'm always happy for comments, heckling, so on during the presentation. If something I say is really confusing and you want me to just revisit it, so please just let me know as I'm going along. Otherwise, I'm just going to proceed through the slides. So first up, this new piece of legislation does make it easier to get a license. So much of the complex web of licensing law that existed before this bill has been preserved, and of course the exercise was to consolidate much of that law, and a worthy exercise that is in better regulation practices. I mean, it's always a good idea when legislation is simplified and consolidated, but of course not to the detriment of other policy objectives that it's seeking to pursue. So in this consolidation exercise, much of the existing or many of the existing rules on how to get a license have been preserved, but in important ways they have been extended. So notably, the removal of the so-called extinguishment provision, where you would have to purchase and then extinguish an on-trade license if you wanted to secure a totally new on-trade license. That has been removed. A new cultural amenity license has been created, a new category of license aimed primarily at cultural establishments like museums, theaters, and so on. Okay. Then there are other aspects of the legislation which have been preserved, which increase the ease with which a license can be procured. For example, the grounds on which one might object to the grant or renewal of a license do not include public health grounds, right? So they are mainly public order grounds and the fitness of the person who is applying for the license. One cannot object to the grant or renewal of a license on public health grounds. And equally, following this consolidation exercise, it is unclear whether or not an NGO can make an objection on behalf of, say, a community. Communities, individuals living in a community which is directly affected by a license have the ability to object under the legislation, but it is unclear whether, for example, Alcohol Action Ireland might make an objection on behalf of that community, whether they have standing to do so. And finally, just there, the district court is now going to be solely responsible for issuing certificates, which, if I understand it right, will probably make it a little bit cheaper, easier, more accessible for people to secure licenses. Now, I mean, as with many of the elements of this bill, it is clear that the whole the whole endeavor is being performed with a pro-economic agenda in mind. To my mind, it is clear that public health is taken, as obviously Frank has already alluded to, right? Public health has clearly taken a back seat to the desire to change the licensing law in favor of economic interests. And well, this is a political decision that has been made. I think it does create quite a difficult environment from, legally speaking, a kind of difficult legal backdrop from which to pursue further public health initiatives on the sale of alcohol should this bill become law as it is. More specifically, with regards to getting the licenses themselves, I think communities under this existing scheme will find it quite difficult to prevent the grant of licenses that have some kind of negative health or other impact. I think that the law does not necessarily put the balance of power into the hands of the communities who may suffer the consequences of the negative health consequences of licenses being granted, especially if there are high concentrations of licenses in particular areas, which again, this law does nothing to prevent, and especially I think the extinguishment, the removal of the extinguishment provision, which was in part designed to prevent that, may well contribute to that concern. So the next area of concern, of course, is grabbing everyone's attention, is this matter of longer sales hours. Now, of course, probably everybody is familiar with this part of the legislation, at least. To summarize, a couple of hours earlier opening on Sundays, an hour later closing Mondays to Thursdays. Times have also been extended around the holidays, Christmas, Patrick's Day, and so on. And also an extra 2.5 hours extra opening for nightclubs is now permitted. In addition to all of that, license holders may now avail of an annual late bar permit. In the previous licensing scheme, one had to apply for an extension to your closing hours every single time you wanted to open late. Now that has been replaced with this annual late bar permit, so that you can just apply once, and that gives you the opportunity then to open until 2:30 at the latest, any night you choose, which is of course quite a liberalization of the rules on sales hours. Now, of course, this extension to hours was done for economic reasons, but one of the arguments that I saw raised in connection with this was that, sure, the opportunity to open late doesn't necessarily mean that everyone will open late, and that establishments might come to some arrangement regarding staggering of closing times. Now, I think that this is not an argument that should be given much credence, really, because there's quite a lot of evidence out there from other jurisdictions who have tried this, notably in England and Wales, which had a rather failed experiment with this. Permitting later closing hours does not really lead to any kind of natural staggering of closing times. Like the establishments do not really do not really make it happen themselves, right? And even when you do have a staggering of closing times, the evidence strongly suggests that this does not really reduce the harm that comes from drinking anyway. Even if there were any evidence that staggering closing times might mitigate some of the harm that later opening will induce, there is no provision in this legislation to allow authorities to compel this, right? If establishments don't do it themselves, there is no way within the bill, there's no authority for public authorities to introduce some form of staggering of closing times in particular hotspot areas, nor is there any power for the guards to seek closure notices or try and procure any kind of staggering themselves, nor is there any possibility to lodge an objection, right, during the license grant and renewal on the basis that there might be a concentration of late opening bars in a particular area, or at least there's no possibility to lodge such a direct objection to that. As Frank has already alluded to, this is highly inconsistent, right, with the direction in which the Public Health Alcohol Act has been pushing Irish alcohol policy. There seems to be a very contradictory push-pull between the strategic direction that the Act supposedly set in motion and the strategic direction that this sale of alcohol bill seems to be pulling in. And I do worry that with such contradictory pieces of large legislation, the Irish alcohol strategy, at least from the politicians' point of view, might become somewhat confused, and it might be hard to then, pursue further measures, right? If you have these two significant but contradictory pieces of legislation in terms of public health objectives, right? So moving swiftly on, because I obviously am running out of time now. Online bills, I think, is something that should be concerning more people, right? It is becoming increasingly easy to buy alcohol online. It is very easy for children in particular to access alcohol online. However, despite the fanfare with which this point was announced by the Minister for Justice when the bill was introduced to the public, the actual level of control that this bill subjects online sales to is negligible. There is one and only one provision in the bill which sets a duty on the person making a delivery of alcohol that has been bought in a distance contract, a duty to check the age of the recipient of the alcohol. And that is it. There is no duty to actually check the age or attempt to check the age of the persons who might actually consume the alcohol. There is no duty to check if any kind of parental permission for underage consumption in the private home exists, because parents can consent to their children, drinking in a private home, but there's no duty to check that that actually is in place. And there are no powers, no legal powers provided by the bill for the delivery person to refuse to supply, to refuse to hand over the alcohol if they suspect that any unlawful consumption is going to take place. There are also no provisions in the bill to do stuff like, requiring more robust age gating to be developed by those who sell alcohol online. So I think that this is one of the maybe overlooked but quite concerning aspects of the bill. As I say, it's increasingly easy to buy alcohol online, but the basic protection that is established in virtually all alcohol licensing laws in every jurisdiction, that of ensuring that you don't sell to underage people in particular, that basic protection is not really extended to the online environment. Obviously, if you're in front of someone in a bar, you're selling alcohol in the bar, you can and you are required to check that those you suspect are underage are in fact not underage. You are required, in particular, if you're selling alcohol, not to sell alcohol to an intoxicated person, right? But again, that is a check that you cannot perform as an online vendor. You cannot check. Now, how would it be possible, indeed, to check that somebody who's buying alcohol through a distance contract isn't already quite intoxicated? So these basic checks are not extended to the distance selling environment, and indeed no effort, as far as I can see, has been made to do that. Again, there is an inconsistency with the Public Health Alcohol Act here. Of course, that act does place far tighter restrictions than previously existed in Irish law on the online advertising of alcohol, digital alcohol advertising will be subject just as much as TV and radio advertising to the tighter controls. And again, there's a kind of push-pull contradiction here. Whilst marketing online is being subject to an increasingly stringent rules, the sale of the alcohol itself is virtually subject to no controls, which I find a little bit concerning. I'm in the process of producing a separate report on children's rights for the Irish Alcohol Forum, which will be hopefully released sometime towards the end of the summer, which goes into much more detail on the issue of children's rights. But I'll give a brief overview here. In addition to obviously the rights to health and so on that clearly might be impacted by the stuff I previously talked about, there are other aspects of children's rights which I think are not really considered so much when this legislation was being drafted. In particular, the way in which kids are allowed to be exposed to drinking culture, right? I think is concerning from a perspective of the rights to development and indeed the rights to health of kids. Things like, alcohol under this bill can still be sold too close to spaces where children are supposed to be able to play safely, right? In particular, social spaces, playgrounds, right? For instance, kids have a right to adequate and appropriate leisure spaces, right? As well. Again, this is contradictory to, or this is contradictory to stuff that's in the Public Health Alcohol Act, where advertising within the vicinity of a school or a playground, right, is prohibited. I think there has not been much effort made to review the duties that have been placed on licensees with regards to preventing harm to minors. I think these are still too weak and too vague in particular. And I think the Act also is inconsistent with the idea of a child as defined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, right? A child should be defined as somebody who is under 18. Yet this bill splits the definition of children in two, right? A child is defined as someone under 15, yet someone aged 15 to 18 is a young person, and young persons are allowed greater access to drinking establishments and to drinking culture under this bill than children are, which I think means that the rights of older children are actually being protected to a weaker extent by this piece of legislation. So I do think that certain children's rights are potentially put at risk by insufficient controls on kids' access to alcohol and exposure to drinking culture through this act, through this, well, maybe soon to be act. There is some inconsistency with the Public Health Alcohol Act, as I've said. Of course, this is a complex issue. It is difficult to interfere, certainly in this jurisdiction, with the constitutional protections given to parents' decision-making. Of course, the constitutional protection given to the family unit, to the parents' right to provide social education to their children, that protection is quite strong. But still, even so, there are ways in which the state can take decisions on kids' access to an engagement with alcohol and can put those decisions into law in a way that is compatible with the Constitution. And I think that not enough responsibility is assumed by the state through this bill in protecting children from developing a relationship with alcohol when they are children and from learning behaviors surrounding alcohol that will lead to harm when they are adults. I think that more could be done in that respect with Irish licensing law in this piece of legislation. So I'm on to now my last slide, which can be probably dealt with fairly quickly, relating to enforcement and monitoring, of course. Having a piece of law is all very well, but if it is unenforceable and it is not monitored, then it is not worth very much. The HSE in particular have quite limited powers compared to the powers that they have or granted in the Public Health Alcohol Act. In particular, there seems to have been either, whether it was a drafting error or whether it was deliberate, I'm not too sure. But the right of the HSE to be informed of applications for grant and renewal for licenses, that was preserved in the Public Health Alcohol Act. That seems to have been, or at least it seems to me, to have been mysteriously deleted by this sale of alcohol bill. And whether that is a drafting mistake, I'm not sure. Probably, I'm not sure that was the intention to remove that right to information. But that is the consequence of the way in which the bill is being drafted anyway, which I would thought should be corrected. It is still very difficult to access any kind of information relating to breaches of licenses, right? You have to physically go to the courts, the district court in Dublin, and request physically and pay a fee information on license breaches. To my understanding, they're not available online, even if you pay for them. So NGOs who are looking to monitor the consequences of this legislation have some difficulty in even accessing things like information on convictions and so on that have been secured under the Act. Speaking of convictions, the Gardaí still have very limited powers, right, to intervene in the running of establishments, in taking, well, I mean, the existing powers that guards have had up to this date are pretty much preserved, which, considering that the hours of sale are being extended, one would have thought that guards might have been given more powers to act in the event of unsafe or unhealthy drinking patterns, right? But that does not seem to have been the case, right? And so I think it would be quite difficult actually to assess in the short to medium term what kind of public health impact the changes in this bill might have. I mean, we have a pretty good idea from all the public health evidence and the modeling what the impact will be, but the actual impact, I think, will be quite difficult to monitor without some effort. And of course, you know, rules that are difficult to enforce won't be enforced. Things like, you know, minors, you know, the obligation on licensees to remove a minor from their premises if it seems to them that they might be reasonably at risk of coming to harm. I mean, the phrasing is different in the bill, but that duty is quite hard for any landlord to interpret confidently, and so will lead to, you know, it being ignored, and very difficult to tell a licensee otherwise, right? As you know, under the phrasing of the duty, as vague as it is. So there are certain rules, again, that are difficult to interpret, difficult to enforce as well. So that brings me to the end of everything that I wanted to say in terms of my legal analysis of this bill from a public health perspective. Sheila, I hope that I've stayed more or less to time. It's always difficult when you're in the moment, unless you've got a stopwatch, which I thoroughly neglected to start. So I hope I've taken up an appropriate amount of time. I'm happy to do questions at any point you want, but I think since I've now finished, I'd better pass back to you, Sheila, to run the rest of the session. Thanks very much, everybody, for listening. And also, I should say that I'm happy to take questions afterwards by email if anybody has them after the workshop is finished. Thanks very much.
Ollie, that was great. Thank you so much indeed. You covered a multitude, and you know, for anyone who hasn't looked at this bill, all 450 pages, that's in the general scheme of things, you actually managed to condense really, really well there, the concerns that are there, that we have around it. So I'm just going to move on to a little bit that I wanted to say myself about the sale of alcohol bill, and hopefully I am. I always have this thing where I kind of go, have I got it up? Yes, I hope I'm sharing it here appropriately. I was saying to people who were kind of, oh gosh, a bit worried that we had a bit of sound or whatever, but you know what? We're all amongst friends here. I think that we're amongst people who understand what we're trying to do and trying to get at. So a little bit about what I wanted to kind of highlight over the next short while before we start our discussion is really just this question of who's going to be carrying the burden of the problems that Ollie has pointed to. And just for those of you who are not maybe familiar with the work of Alcohol Action Ireland, we're here for 20 years. We're an independent advocate for reducing alcohol harm. We've been very focused on a principal goal that we have has been to have the implementation of the Public Health Alcohol Act. And you know what? There has been an awful lot of success with that act, and firstly in getting it passed in the first place. And indeed, what we've highlighted there in the green is what has been implemented. What we're still waiting for in the yellow is in progress or not quite there yet. But all of that, and of course the labelling, as Frank alluded to, is hopefully coming up in the next 3 years. But that sort of progress was only really possible by, I suppose, joining forces. We're a small organisation ourselves. There's only 3 of us. So it's simply not possible, to make these sorts of things happen. It really happens by partnership, and we saw that hugely during, the passage of the Public Health Alcohol Act. That different voices coming in. At certain points, maybe emphasising the things that were of most concern to that particular organisation, at other points joining with others, who had their particular concerns. And so, what we want to do here is to try and think, well, where's the burden going to fall? Who are the people who might be able to best speak in those sorts of regards? And how can we harness those voices best of all? And I did just throw up there that I think we are seeing some progress. We are seeing a little bit of a drop in alcohol consumption. Let's not lose it by, going the opposite direction with the sale of alcohol bill. And as you can see, we are still drinking at fairly hefty levels. The industry is always very keen to say, oh, well, we're drinking less than we did, say 20 years ago. That's true. But you know what? 20 years ago, we were drinking at incredibly high levels. Where we're at the moment, just to put it into a little bit of context, if we were all to drink at the low risk drinking guidelines, we'd be drinking about 37% less than what we're drinking at the moment. So we still have really quite a way to go before we can say that, we have considerably reduced the harms. And those harms are there. It's obvious. Anyone working in this sphere, I could pick any number of statistics, to quote here. There's just a few. Some that just really jump out at me. For me, 4 people dying every day, and I think of the impact that is on families. And when we look at those deaths, 1,400, maybe 1,500 deaths, about a third of those are due to incident. And what I mean by that is, something like perhaps a fall, or maybe an assault, or perhaps somebody, through self-harm. And I'm, hugely conscious that particularly when we talk about extending licensing hours, those sorts of harms, really do come to the fore. And of course, the other big impact, is not just harm on the individual, but harm to those around. And we know, for example, that there's 200,000 children who are currently living in homes that are already seriously impacted by alcohol. And one of the things that is very, very clear to us, and what the evidence is, that actually when you increase the density of alcohol outlets, you're actually more likely to increase the likelihood of domestic violence, the increases in that. From a licensing hours, we know, again, internationally, the evidence would tell us that just simply increasing even by an hour will make a significant difference. And but the thing about that is it makes a difference both ways. So if you increase the hours, you see more crime, you see more injuries. If you decrease the hours, you actually see a reduction in violence and a reduction in the harms that are there. So I think, for us, I always look at that in a very positive kind of a way. It's not all doom and gloom. We can actually change things for the better. And as I say, just to give you some statistics there about, density of outlets. And for those of you who are kind of wondering, well, anything, straight down, not just talking about the international evidence, we know we already have the evidence here in Ireland that we have very severe impacts that it would be on our emergency services, just for example. There's lots of other places that I could point to for evidence. And in fact, actually, the canal communities did some very good work a number of years ago, looking at that density of outlets and how it had increased and how that relates to different harms. We don't have far to go to find our nearest bar. Our colleagues at the University of Sheffield did some work, Colin Angus, looking at that density. And Ireland actually per capita has one of the largest or the highest numbers of bars per capita. So when we're talking about the possibilities of increasing the number of outlets for alcohol, you really have to look at it in the context that we already have a huge amount that's there already. A phrase I've heard being used is that Ireland is overpubbed. It's a bit of a new one, but I heard that recently as a particular phrase. So what's going on? What can we do? Where are we at? So just to take a step back, the general scheme of this bill was published last autumn. It was then subject to pre-legislative scrutiny. We were very happy that we were asked to contribute and to give evidence to the Oireachtas Committee on Justice, along with our colleagues in the Institute of Public Health and with Alcohol Forum and with ICANN. And I do feel that we were listened to. And certainly if you look at the report that came from the committee, there were a number of key recommendations in that we had called for. And very particularly, I think the thing that we were pleased to see was that there was a call for a health impact assessment of this bill. One of the things that strikes me about the bill is that when you look at it as a student, the general scheme, generally speaking, there's a purpose for a bill right at the top. And it says, the reason for this bill, is whatever. That actually wasn't made clear, in this particular bill, that there was no public health imperative actually listed there. So one of the things that we are certainly looking for is to see, will this assessment be carried out? Who's going to carry it out? What's actually going to be within it? And we really would be pressing for that. And as Ollie mentioned earlier, as yet, there's nothing in the bill about monitoring of what's going on. Now, again, with any new piece of legislation, it's absolutely incumbent. If you're going to do something new, well, you really need to look and see, well, actually, was that a good idea? Was that a bad idea? And the only way you can really measure these things is if you actually put in place the monitoring procedures that are necessary, that allow you to be able to see what has been the impact of the legislation. So what we have been doing is we've been meeting with politicians. We've been writing lots of letters to various ministers. Obviously, the Minister for Justice is the main one there. We've been having PQs asked, and we ourselves have been, developing our own social media campaign around this. So, one of the things, as I say, we've been focusing on is this question of, the burden, that's there. Who's going to clean up? Who's going to carry the burden? And these are some of the assets that we've been developing around that. We've also been putting together a number of videos. We have 3 of them up on our website at the moment, where we've asked some experts in the area to take a look at it. We compiled, we put 3 of them together. They're available individually, and I'll just give you a little bit of a sense of what they are.
My name is Dr Claire Wilkinson. I'm a senior researcher at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia.
Hello, I'm Colin Angus. I'm a senior research fellow in the Sheffield Alcohol Research Group.
I'm Carol Fawcett. I'm a co-founder of Silent Voices, a former chair of Alcohol Action Ireland for about 8.5 years. And I am someone with the lived experience of growing up in a home with parental problem alcohol use.
So there's a really good body of evidence that increasing the availability of alcohol, so the hours in which it's available or the number of outlets, is associated with increases in alcohol-related harms, particularly violence, but also other types of alcohol-related harms, such as alcohol-related traffic accidents and domestic violence.
So there's a study from Amsterdam which found that an additional hour of opening in the nighttime economy for clubs and bars was associated with a 33% increase in injuries.
So law enforcement, a big portion of their work on a Friday, Saturday night is around alcohol-related harms. Same with hospital emergency departments. Alcohol-related presentations are a big part of the workload, particularly on weekends.
Our children who are living at risk with PPAU and domestic violence, they will carry the burden because they are our futures. And if we don't invest seriously in their health and well-being, and not just lip service and not just words and documents, but actions, they will carry the burden, and they will carry it into the next generation, and the generations after that will carry it into the future generations. It will never end. We have to stop the rot and invest in our children who are at risk from PPAU and DV.
Well, thanks very much, actually, for those words. It really, you know, very, very powerful to us. Oh dear, I had a feeling that might happen. Just give me a second to adjust that thing there. Apologies. Just come back actually to our presentation. So what else can we do at this stage? One of the things that we are looking to do is we'll increase the number of videos that we have, and we're reaching out to a number of organizations, and really if there are people here from particular organizations you feel that might be able to help us on that front, definitely please get in touch. We'd really be asking people to amplify our voices on social media, you know, to share the content that's out there. We're also looking for spokespeople from a number of organizations who can help us with our media commentary on this. We're putting together some letters that individuals can send to their politicians, and really, you know, that local thing I think is very important. So sometimes there where we've been talking about, you know, the broad kind of piece on a national, international thing, I think if you take it down local, what's it like in my town? What's it like actually here? Why would I be concerned if there's more alcohol being sold in this particular area? So with that, I'm going to stop what I want to say at the moment, and I'll hand back to you, Frank, and see maybe just if we could perhaps open up the discussion to our audience here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sheila, and thank you very much, Ollie, for two great presentations. I thought yours, Ollie, was like Halloween. It was a frightening outlining, I think, of the challenges within it. And really, it's a call to arms, I think, to outlining why we need to take action, and really fits in very well with Sheila's view of the sorts of actions we need to take. So I'm sure there's some questions in relation to that. And if you could raise your hands, I would be grateful if you wish to ask any questions.
Just a couple of comments maybe while we're waiting for people. Sean Darcy has said, could we run a campaign highlighting the costs, I suppose, the 3.7 billion and the 11% of the healthcare budget previous to road campaigns? And I guess that's something that we always talk about in Alcohol Action Ireland, about trying to do something like that. So maybe bringing everyone together to do that would be a good idea. Any thoughts on that? Any hands? Ideas maybe for kind of like what you would like to see in a campaign potentially going forward?
I think it's worth, there was a very interesting, you made a couple of comments there during your presentation, Ollie, about the national strategy for alcohol. There isn't an active strategy now. We have an out-of-date strategy which is no longer applying. So, and also we've nobody responsible. Who do you go to about alcohol-related issues in Ireland? Who is responsible for that? Nobody. So we have a real gap in that regard. And in fact, the European Association for the Study of the Liver recently produced a policy on alcohol, and it highlighted the need for A, strategy, and B, a robust mechanism for implementing that strategy and people responsible for reducing alcohol harms. And that's not the case in Ireland, I'm afraid, as you can see. Are there any hands up? Does anybody else want to make any comment?
No hands at the moment. Another comment that was made by Marianne Beasley is just in terms of the objections that can be made around licensing, and currently the HSE, fire officers, local authorities and Gardaí can do that, but the proposal to have an annual permit will be much more challenging, I suppose. And she was saying consideration needs to be given to the costs and the impact on public health and the additional burden. And I guess that's what our campaign kind of, the graphics that Sheila put is feeding into that concept of the burden. Where is the burden going to be? And kind of, we think that's a kind of a good way to get public attention and the attention of the Gardaí and the emergency services and everyone who's concerned, but just also the public too, who there are going to be impacts on the public and society in general that people might not kind of think of when they think of extended opening hours.
That's very, very true, Jennifer. I've seen a couple of hands up. We'll go through them in order if we can. I've seen Mark Murphy and then Bobby Smith and Sean Darcy. But Mark.
Hi there, thanks for the presentation, and it was really good and a bit worrying. I just think for any campaign, it'd be great if you could share kind of social media content that we could use on our own. Sorry, I'm from the Irish Heart Foundation as well. If you could share social media content that we could use on our own Twitter account, or if you're looking for spokespeople, if you could share, like, if you could draft up some kind of like briefing page on talking points or questions that you might get posed in the media, or like some kind of like Mythbuster document, some kind of Mythbuster briefing page. Because I'm sure if you get all the kind of the misinformation saying, oh, this will lead to less jobs, all that kind of stuff. So kind of a Mythbuster fact sheet would be great, just for any kind of to kind of help out in the campaign. But great to be involved, and thanks.
Thanks very much, Mark. Yeah, we certainly keep you in mind in relation to that. I might just add too, in terms of jobs within the alcohol sector, the biggest employer in the alcohol sector in Ireland is the health service, dealing with the downstream consequences, followed by the criminal justice system, I think. But I mean, it's important we think about that. The real enterprise, the real development of jobs has been dealing with the consequences rather than serving the alcohol. Thank you, Mark. Bobby.
Yeah, I suppose a comment and a question. The comment is just something that struck me during the course of Ollie's presentation, that I had initially seen this bill as a piece of legislation that was very aligned to the on-trade, financial agenda. But the whole piece about the online purchasing is clearly an opportunity for the big supermarkets and retailers. So it's odd that that's been thrown in there as well. That's just an observation, I suppose. And then the question is, I suppose, for Ollie, if you could just talk a little bit more about the this issue of the legislation referring to some entity called young people, which you said were, I think, according to legislation, 15 to 18-year-olds. Is that something that's in the current legislation? Because I know there are some complicated rules about the age or the time at which young people and children and under 18s need to be out of bars. Is it just an extension of that, or is it some sort of modification of that, or is it something completely new?
Yeah, thanks very much, Bobby. Yeah, it's preserved from previous legislation. So the general gist of it is that there's a cutoff time, 9 p.m. Before that, children, so under 15s, can be in a bar with their parents. After it, they cannot. Young people, however, can be in a bar by themselves up to 9 a.m. without the need for parental supervision. So there's just a couple of bits in the bill whereby the 15 to 18-year-olds are allowed slightly more and slightly unaccompanied access to drinking establishments whilst alcohol is being served. Of course, alcohol can't be served to an under 18-year-old, but it's about the access to the establishment, even while alcohol service is going on. That is, I think, it is clearly very contradictory to international children's rights frameworks, which say that children are under 18-year-olds. Yet this bill seems to leave older children with less protection. And that's concerning in particular because it's older children who will be in that stage of life where they're starting to question their environment, explore new things. And it's at that age where actually they need more protection, arguably, from developing potentially harmful behaviors that might be harmful to them in adulthood. So yeah, it's preserved from the previous legislation, but I still think it's something that should be called out, right? That this bill is wildly inconsistent with a number of aspects of children's rights protection. So I hope that answers the question.
I might just add a comment if I can there, Ollie. It's an excellent question and an excellent answer. I wonder, will we look back at our failure to protect children from alcohol rather like we failed to protect children from abuse over the last generations? I mean, I think that there is, as a nation, and indeed other countries are the same, we failed to protect children from alcohol. I think that it's and I wonder, actually, listening to your presentation, Ollie, whether we should take that child protection issue as being of paramount importance, because I think it really is. It was very striking from your slides, from your presentation, that we're getting a huge fail on this bill in that area. Anyway, I'll move on to Sean Darcy if I can there, please. Sean, welcome.
Okay, thanks very much, Frank. Appreciate that, and thanks very much to Sheila and all the guys, Ollie, for this excellent presentation. Just something that strikes me. I'm just wondering about this sale of alcohol bill, and if I just reverse a bit, like in Ireland we've celebrated the smoking campaign, the legislation, the benefits that we've had for 20 years or so, and we're proud, and everyone stands up and says well done to the politicians. But I'm just wondering, this current sale of alcohol, if that was enacted like in its present format, and this is to Ollie probably, where does that leave Ireland, in the class, as it were, in terms of protecting our population, protecting our children? Any sense at all where we would be? Like, would we be the worst in class of all the 200 countries in the world? Or, because I'm just trying to get a sense of that, because I do really believe passionately in, campaigns that are going to, in some respects, shock people, because people need to understand, what is coming down the road, not least the last chat there between Bobby and Ollie about children. But I'm just wondering if we have any sense at all, if this was enacted, how bad are we going to be? Please.
Thanks very much indeed that's a very good question, Sean. And there are two answers, an accurate one and a guess. I think the accurate one would take a whole load of comparative research to answer. My guess is that many other jurisdictions, indeed most other jurisdictions, pay a similarly low level of attention to children's rights and the sale of alcohol. So my guess is that if this was enacted as it was, then probably Ireland would be no better or worse than many other countries in terms of the legal duties that it places on licensees, on guards, on public authorities to protect children from the sale of alcohol. As we've already said, the Act, the Public Health Alcohol Act, is world leading in terms of the preventative upstream measures that it enacts in terms of marketing, in terms of retail restrictions as well, physical segregation in stores of alcohol. All of this stuff is fairly groundbreaking, right, and puts Ireland quite clearly at the forefront of public health policy. But say that the sale of the stuff itself, my sense is that no better or no worse than many other jurisdictions. And like I say, we could do a comparative exercise. And it's funny you should mention that. I'm currently working with some folk at the WHO advising countries who are building up their licensing laws from scratch. And there are certain countries in Europe who actually don't have any licensing laws surrounding alcohol. If you thought this was bad, try removing the whole scheme entirely, and then you get what some countries in Europe have. And my experience there has taught me that many, the licensing regimes have to be to a certain extent bespoke to countries. So there is a certain amount of comparing we can do. There's a certain amount of comparing which is, not really possible. But my sense is that, this is one of those issues that has largely been ignored by most jurisdictions. I mean, it's really only disappointing here because Ireland have this, as many have termed it, this once in a generation opportunity to revise and rewrite our licensing laws, and it's not being taken. Now, some of that is due to the complex interaction with constitutional protections, as I say, to family, the family unit and so on. But I think there is more that can be done, especially around the protection of young people. And as I say, if you're interested, I'm working with Paula Leonard from ICANN on the second, well, I think it's the second in a planned series of reports on this bill. I'm writing it on children's rights. So there will be more detail forthcoming on that particular aspect soon, shortly, I hope. But anyway, hopefully that answers your question as well.
Thank you very much. We have 3 hands up. I'm going to ask just for a sentence each from each of the 3 of you, if that's all right, because we're just right up against the end. Anne D, to start, please. How are you, Anne?
Hi, I'm fine. I'm kind of here wearing 2 hats. I'm representing the IMO and I have a public health hat. I have a few questions, but I'm going to put them all into one sentence, Frank. My questions are, does the Constitution define what a child is? Or is there any other legislation that talks about children that defines what a child is? And I suppose my question then is, if you have 2 pieces of legislation that kind of contradict, they say different things, can you challenge one using the other? It seems to me, or that's a question for Ollie. That's a series of questions for Ollie. Sorry, Frank.
Okay, well, Ollie, we'll give you a sentence for that complex question.
I don't think that a child is defined in the Constitution. The only provisions in the Constitution relating to children are on the ones I've mentioned, plus adoption and so on. I don't think it's defined in there, but it may well be in other pieces of legislation. Children are defined as, minors are defined as under 18s. I would have to look into that more, but I suspect that there would be some inconsistency, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Anne. Thank you, Ollie. And a brief question from Emmett there, please, next. How are you, Emmett?
Hi, Frank. Just a quick observation, really, on discussion around young people. We did the latest of the 3 planned Planet Youth surveys here in the west of Ireland with about 5,000 young people back in November. And we were seeing worryingly increasing levels of binge drinking and alcohol use, a few other things as well. But possibly the most worrying finding was an increasing parental tolerance for drinking behavior. Very clearly came out of the 3rd survey as a trend that we saw. And looking at the different geographical areas where that's stronger, what's become very, very clear is actually parental tolerance around underage alcohol use is really, really a significant problem. Now we've commissioned an additional look at this. Actually, can we examine this in a bit more detail? We already know that the kids that are getting alcohol from parents are likely 6 times more likely to be getting drunk and so on. But even the parental attitude around alcohol seems to have an even greater effect. So, and it's rippling out into the community and into sports clubs and into getting served in pubs. And so wherever communities we see the parents are more tolerant, access to alcohol is, increasingly, and the kids are getting drunk more. So I just wanted to raise that as a point more than anything. It's going to be, but I think there's probably a lot of public health messaging that can be done in this space, because whilst the legality is you can provide alcohol to your own child in your own home, it's the rest of it is very woolly, and parents seem to think that by doing this maybe they're doing the right thing, when in fact all the evidence says they're not. And so I think a lot more work is hopefully going to get done in that space, but maybe I'll come back to the group when the research is finished into that particular topic, and it might be something that we could try and look towards a bigger campaign around from public health nationally.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And in fact, Bobby Smith, who's spoken earlier on, gives very strong messages in relation to doing the opposite of what you said you're finding. So we know that's really harmful. So thanks a lot, Emmett. I think it is something we should think about more. Ewan.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, just a couple of quick observations, appreciating your time. I think to go back to one of the points about why is this happening, I think you got to recognize that there is a global trend towards liberalization of licensing. And I think that's largely in response to Western governments largely taking a more proactive role in trying to promote public health measures. This is typical of what happens in neoliberal democracies. There's always a balancing act by government to on one hand to give on public health measures, but on the other hand to soften some of the cost for industry. And I think what we're seeing here is a further playing out of that. In that context, I would suggest that in the framing of some of the issues that we need to address here, we should recognize that there's a certain inevitability about this legislation, that it is going to happen. And I think that, you know, the direction of travel on that is quite firm. And so therefore we fall possibly into a position where we're trying to, you know, prevent barriers or put up barriers whereby we might be able to gain some achievements. And I think there needs to be a reflection on that, to say, like, one of the strongest things I think is required is the introduction of a public health criteria into the bill. But equally, which we haven't discussed, and Ollie I don't think raised, is the licensing extinguishment, which is a real problem for the vintners and the license holders in Dublin City in particular. So it may be that there's a bit of a balance and a bit of an alliance that perhaps could be fashioned there, because if there's some action given, which I suspect there will be, to soften the licensing extinguishment, which is a competition issue around the market, there may be a quid pro quo that can be struck in relation to establishing a public health criteria specifically into the licensing application.
Very, very good points. I like that idea of a kind of a trade-off or negotiation. It may be the only way to influence it, I think, Ewan. Thank you very much for that comment and for your wisdom around alcohol in general. Final comment from Trish, please.
I just want to mention, I suppose it's not a question, but mention and acknowledge all the children in homeless services. And just when you're a child in a B&B, even if your own mother is trying to protect you from alcohol and everything else that goes on there, you know, the level of violence around the child in the next room through the whole B&B situation, on many, many nights of the week, what children are being exposed to and the trauma, the absolute trauma, even where parents are trying to protect their children from situations around alcohol, it still seems to have a huge impact, you know, and thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Trish, and thank you for all the comments there. I'd just like to say thank you very much for all of you for participating here today, and to ask for you to participate further. I think your voices are very important in terms of having many voices objecting from many points of view to the bill. And I think we should think about the strategy as well in terms of how we try and leverage along the lines there that was suggested by Ewan. So thank you very much for taking part, for your contributions. Thank you, Sheila, and thank you, Ollie, for your presentations, which were a great call to arms. Sheila, do you have any final words you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Just to say to everybody that you know, we'll circulate the presentation slides you know, to people who have registered for the event. We'll keep in touch with you. Thank you for giving us your email addresses by registering in the first place. So we'll keep in touch with you as we develop the campaign. And I really appreciate that the various offers that have come in, there's a number of people have contacted as well through the chat, and we'll certainly be taking you up on those offers. And just to say again, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Excellent session. Thanks a million.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheila. Bye. Thank you. Bye.